Welcome back to Journalism 102. You've learned a little bit about writing for the web and how to make your story more visually appealing to the online reader in terms of the visual nature of the text with the bullets and the white space, as well as how to satisfy their wishes for comprehensiveness as well as very specific entry points to stories. This lecture is really going to focus on how you get them to find your story in the first place and select your story. And on the web, headlines are critically important. So headlines have always been important in journalism, but on the web, they're really the entry point to your story, and they're often the only information a reader has about the content of your story before they decide whether or not they're going to choose your story to read or that of a competitor. So we're going to talk about something called search engine optimization. It's an expression that term that you may or may not have heard of before. It's often called by its acronym SEO. And one of the reasons why SEO is so important to journalists who, are working in a digital age is that 35% of more of traffic comes to sites through search. So comes to site through search engines like Google, Yahoo. So people are finding the news and information that they want by using search engines. It is important. It is really, for some websites, kind of make or break kind of techniques. So as a journalist, you need to be aware of how SEO plays into the success of your stories. Here's an example of an eye tracking heat map. So with eye tracking studies, what they do is they actually put sort of special glasses on online users, and they track how they use a website. So when, how much time do they spend and where do they spend that time on specific areas of a website. So the one that I've circled here, as you can see, that's Google results. So you can certainly see the more red something is, that means the more time that users are spending looking at that information. So as you can see here, it is imperative that your story show up high in the search results if you want people to read it. Very few people are looking beyond those top 3 results. That's why talking about SEO and how web headlines play into SEO is so important. So word choice and location really matter. So you want to use keywords throughout your site, and for writers, and that's really what you are here, you want to use keywords in the headlines and high in the text. So what are keywords? Keywords are simply those words that you as an online user will type into a search box, into the Google search box or the Yahoo search box or the Bing search box to find information. So it's a lot of just sort of being intuitive and thinking about, what is somebody going to put in that search box if they want to find information about what's happening at this year's double-decker. Well, they're probably going to put the words double-decker in. They may or may not put in the words Oxford. They'll probably put in the word festival, and they'll probably put in the word schedule or something like that. So if I were going to write a headline about the double-decker festival schedule, I would make sure that I put those words in my headline, and I would try to get those words high up in the text of my story as well. The word Oxford probably makes sense to put in there as well, because double-decker, there may be other places in the world that have double-decker festivals. The other thing is that you want to make it as specific as possible, which we'll talk about more in just a second. So there are actually some tools online that can sometimes help you make better choices about the words that you put in your headlines. If it's something that doesn't get a lot of search, a lot of traffic, so most little local stories, this probably isn't going to be a tool that affects you. But if you're writing a story on a topic that is getting a lot of attention, using something like Google Trends to search what words are being most commonly used can be valuable. So I'm just going to give you an example of one that we could probably pretty intuitively guess, but oftentimes our university public relations folks, you'll see using the term University of Mississippi in news releases that they send out. Maybe the words Ole Miss might be a better choice for them. By typing in both of these sort of terms, keyword terms, and separating them by a comma, I'm now using Google Trends to compare how often does Ole Miss show up when people are searching. So how often are they using the keywords Ole Miss versus how often are they using the keywords University of Mississippi. And as you might expect, the word search terms Ole Miss show up way more often than the search terms University of Mississippi. So if I were going to write a story that relates to Ole Miss, I'm going to use that term over the term UM or University of Mississippi. So in headlines, you don't want to tease. It used to be 10, 15 years ago that a lot of headlines, web headlines, were very cutesy. They were sort of trying to entice you to click on them. But what we've found is that online users, remember we talked about this in the last lecture, they're solution hunting. They're looking for answers to very specific questions. They're looking for specific information that they want about a topic. So that means your headline needs to be straightforward, needs to tell you exactly what that story is about. Be descriptive. Sometimes it's going to feel like it's really boring, but better to have a quote-unquote boring headline that does not mislead the viewer than something really cute that they're going to click on and then be very sorry that they did. So you don't want to sort of hurt your organization's credibility by tricking people into clicking on your story. So let's take a look at just this sample website and look at the headlines that we have here. Based on what you see here and based on what we just talked about with headlines needing to be very straight and to the point, which one would you say is the least effective? Berlusconi sentenced in tax case, Hurricane Sandy bears down on U.S., riches found in ancient Mayan tomb, girl activist safe in UK, says father, Rio de Janeiro landmark turns 100, rioter shot in Peru market clashes, and U.S. policeman in cannibal plot. To me, the worst headline is probably girl activist safe in UK, says father. I don't really know enough about that story to know if I'm interested. So it may not be the best headline for people that don't already know part of the story. You might be able to make that same argument for U.S. policeman in cannibal plot, but just that term cannibal plot is probably enough to make me click because that's really unusual. The best headline here, another one, tough to make a good judgment on that because I think most of these headlines are really pretty strong. I would say probably Berlusconi sentenced in tax case is the most straightforward and to the point, although I think you could easily make an argument for the Hurricane Sandy headline or the riches headline, rioters headline. Maybe the Rio de Janeiro headline might be better if you said specifically what landmark it was, but that might make the headline too long because short is also good with headlines. So most of these headlines are really strong. If I had to pick the weakest, I would say the girl activist headline gives me the least amount of information, sort of presumes that I already know enough about the story to know what this headline is taking me to. So in general, what makes a good headline? The most interesting word or phrase near the start. Avoiding names unless that person is famous. Now, you could make an argument that you didn't know who the heck Berlusconi was, so that headline wasn't as good for you as maybe the Hurricane Sandy headline. The sort of how-to or why headlines, or the second person headline. So check for your name. Why are you gaining weight? How do you get a bigger tax refund? So those kinds of terms seem to work well. Looking at this list of attributes of good headlines, one thing that might be a good rewrite for one of the headlines we've just seen would be the cannibal plot. So maybe you would rewrite that headline to say cannibal plot involves U.S. policemen. That could potentially be an even stronger headline if you take a look at some of these characteristics. So let's look again at another site. In this situation, we have, do you know this man? So that's talking about that second person headline, and that might work well for a headline that's just appearing on your own website, and it might drive traffic to people who are already there. But the question is that going to be good search engine optimization? Are people going to be putting in the words, do you know this man? Or are they going to be putting in the words Madison bank robbery? So think about the fact that the most interesting words or phrase near the start is really key to writing a good search engine optimized headline. Quite possibly best photo gallery ever. That one is probably the weakest on this particular little screenshot. The best in terms of being very straightforward and search engine friendly is Bryant calls for state finance expansion of medical school. That tells you exactly what that story is about. Other things that make for a good headline: a simple or straightforward and active voice. Emphasizing a twist or compelling fact. So remember, we talked about the cannibal headline. Again, that's a little odd, right? We don't often hear about policemen involved or police officers involved in cannibalism. And then passes the what's in it for me. So again, when I click on that, do I know what I'm getting? So that's really key to good online headlines. So we referenced Jakob Nielsen in our previous lecture about web writing, and he also has some really strong, I think, headline tips. One is that headlines are short, and in fact I believe it's 72 characters, it might be 70 characters, that after that point, if you have more than 70 characters in your headline, it actually gets truncated by Google, so you get the ... So that's not going to make a very good headline. So keep it to 70 or so characters or less. Rich in information sent. So what does that mean? It means you really get an idea of what the story is about based on the headline. So it's giving off the scent of what the news is within the story. It's front-loaded, meaning if you know that Ole Miss gets used a lot more than University of Mississippi, and that somebody searching for a story about football recruits at Ole Miss is probably going to put Ole Miss football recruits, you want those words to be at the beginning of your headline. Understandable out of context, so what that means is if the only information I have is what's in the headline, that I know what your story is about, so it shouldn't have to make sense only when you see the photo in the first photo of the photo gallery, that you should be able to understand it even if you don't have any other clues provided to you. And predictable, so again this gets back to when I click on it, I know what I'm going to get. And he writes about all of these things on a website called useit.com, which if you're interested in this is a wealth of information and can really help you go deeper on this topic. He also has selected in the past, the best headline writing organizations, and one of them that is mentioned by him consistently is the BBC. So if you want to look at a website that does a good job of writing headlines that are very direct and to the point, front-loaded, a good length, etc., the BBC is a good one for you to check out. So why is this even important for you as a journalist, right? And it's because great headlines get people to see or hear your work. So why write something if you're not trying to get an audience for it? And if you write a headline well, it can double or better the amount of readers for your story. So you want to spend as much time thinking about the headline of your story as you do that lead, because you can't get people to read that lead unless you've gotten them to click on your headline. So part of your assignment for this week is going to be to create a free WordPress account. So using your Ole Miss email, please, because that's how I'm going to be able to invite you to the class blog, you need to create an account on WordPress, and you should check your email for an invitation to the class blog. I'm going to try to send out these invites sometime later this week. I would say start looking for the invite on Wednesday or so. That way I can be fairly certain that most of you will have seen these lectures before I send the invite out. If you don't receive the invite, please email me. If you don't see it in your email when you finish this lecture and hear that this is part of what we're doing, please email me so I can resend the invite, because you won't be able to complete your assignments for next week unless you're already a member of the class blog. So be sure to go on discussions and see more details about how to register for the WordPress account.